Hello, everyone, and welcome back from break. Thank you for joining us today during our symposium, The Deadly Intersection of White Supremacy and Guns. To fully understand the link between gun culture and white supremacist political violence, it is critical not only to examine moments when violence erupts, but to consider how cultural norms create conditions for such violence. A portion of this next panel will explain the political ideology at the heart of dominant gun culture and examine the cultural implications of laws that allow visibly armed people in public, particularly at political demonstrations. Public health researchers will also discuss the spike in gun purchasing during the pandemic and explore its relationship to elevated beliefs in Christian nationalism, support for January 6 insurrectionists, and racial resentment and prejudice among gun buyers during the pandemic, as well as an alarming increase in individuals' willingness to engage in political violence. I'll now turn it over to Kelly.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelly Ruscombe. I'm the Director of Law and Policy at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, and I am both honored and alarmed to be introducing this panel to you today on guns, racism, and extremism in the United States. We're going to be hearing from Alexandra Felindra, an Associate Professor of Political Science and Psychology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She specializes in American gun politics, immigration policy, race and ethnic politics, and political psychology. Her book, Race, Rights, and Rifles, The Origins of the NRA and Contemporary Gun Culture, available later this year, analyzes the origins of the NRA and the relationship between ideologies of citizenship grounded in white male supremacy and support for guns and political violence. We'll also hear from Angela Stroud, an Associate Professor of Sociology and Social Justice at Northland College on the South Shore of Lake Superior. Her research examines how white masculinity shapes U.S. culture, particularly with respect to ideas about guns, protection, and apocalypticism. Themes she takes up in her 2016 book, Good Guys with Guns: The Appeal and Consequences of Concealed Carry. Her current project examines how political progressives explain their gun ownership. We'll hear from Dr. Edelyn Verona, who is the co-director of the Center for Justice Research and Policy, and is professor of psychology at the University of South Florida. Her research is at the intersection of psychology and crime, with a more recent focus on intervention, prevention, and policy reform. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Garen Wintemute, a distinguished professor of emergency medicine and the Baker Terrett Chair in Violence Prevention at UC Davis. He directs the California Firearms Violence and Research Center. As a reminder, our viewers can submit questions for our panelists at cgvs@jhu.edu. We highly encourage it so you can get all the information you need from our panelists. So first, we'll be hearing from Dr. Felindra.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. I am Alexandra Felindra, and I will be presenting on my ongoing research related to white supremacy and the support for gun rights, gun ownership, and more recently, the issue of political violence. I will be presenting some data that are part of my upcoming book called Race, Rights, and Rifles: The Origins of the NRA and Modern Gun Culture, which is coming out with the University of Chicago Press. And it goes back to the American Revolution and highlights the origins of this white male supremacy ideology and how it has been entangled with ideas of citizenship and being a good American. For today, let's start with talking about the different forms of political violence that we see today. There is an increase in political violence, both in terms of threats and in terms of actual violence that we see in political settings. We see, for example, armed intimidation against protesters, even assault and violence against protesters. We see threats of violence against elected officials and their staff, and also violence against elected officials and their families. And we see a lot of racist and sexist phone calls, messages, and email with the purpose of intimidating and gagging, silencing voices that people who ascribe to this type of ideology do not like. We have also come to see, in terms of January 6th, attacks on actual American institutions. Current research, that is my ongoing research today, based on 60-hour-long interviews with state legislators and local elected officials and their staff. And what I've seen, based on the preliminary analysis that I have so far done, I've already seen that about almost 10% of people, of my informants, uh, said that they experienced actual violence. They were assaulted. There was an actual criminal act against them committed. About the majority of people that I talked to reported threats to the police of different kinds that ranged from threatening phone calls to people showing up with bullets at their homes or at their offices, a variety, a range of events that were indicated threats and violence. And every woman and person of color that I've talked to reported racist or sexist or both bullying and trolling that was very scary and very horrific and very persistent. And everyone, all 60 people that I've talked to, reported rude and uncivil behaviors by citizens towards elected officials. Um, these events have repercussions. They can affect political behavior, and we have to be really conscious about and understand what's happening. A number of people considered quitting, and at least one did quit their job because of this constant barrage of violence and threats. Other people have talked about changing their interactions, the style of interactions with the public. They have talked about uh, second thoughts on whether they will sponsor or co-sponsor certain types of legislation because they do not want to be targeted and have to deal with this kind of behavior from citizens. So it's not just that this is happening, it affects representation, it affects our political institutions in a very substantive way. Existing research on political violence suggests that a small but not negligible minority of Americans are vulnerable to violent radicalization. The number is really small when you ask people about specific violent behaviors and make it graphic, and you don't just ask generic questions. But still, it is very disconcerting and worrying because in a population of 300 and some million, even a 2 and 3% support of political violence is a lot of people. We know from this research that partisanship and ideology fuels these tendencies. But that's not the only thing that fuels these tendencies. We have evidence, for example, that people who were concerned about their party losing the election were far more likely to support violence in order to prevent such a loss. And we know very well from a long-standing research in terrorism and related fields that leaders, elected leaders, visible leaders, media leaders, religious leaders can help pacify followers and mitigate the problem of political violence, or can fuel it through their words and through inciting passions in the public. Existing research on January 6th, especially the work of Pape, has shown that contrary to some lore going around in the media, the people who participated in this type of event are not poor people who are under-resourced, who are unemployed, who don't have an education, and who are very desperate and angry about it. They're actually white men who are white-collar workers, business owners, and more worrisomely, figures of authority. About 1/5, 20% of the people who were charged in relation to January 6th were served in the military or the police. So there are people with institutional ties, there are people who have communal ties, there are people who are looked up to because they're figures of authority. They're educated people, and that makes it very worrisome that the leaders in this type of activity are not people who they don't conform to the type of stereotype that we see in public discourse. My research and my book suggests that actually support for these types of behaviors, for political violence, for guns, comes from specific ideology, basically an ideology of white male supremacy. What I show is that actually the American public, and especially white Americans, hold two distinct and oppositional ideologies. One, which I call inclusive or multiculturalism, is an ideology that rests on respect for the culture of others, community engagement, and political participation, as well as peaceful resolution of political conflict. The exclusive ideology, the exclusive vision of American citizenship, is basically white male supremacy ideology an ideology that embraces the idea that Christian nationalism, nativism, and whiteness, as well as traditional gender norms. In this research, I asked people what makes one a true American. This is part of a nationally representative survey of white Americans. And as we see, for about 70% of white Americans, their vision of what constitutes the true American, is inclusive and it's part of the volunteering in the community, voting in elections, ensuring that citizens get the vote, and also committed to solving political differences through peaceful means. Statistically and conceptually, these items are part of a single ideology. They're linked and they coexist in the white mind. By contrast, we have about 35%, 36% of white Americans who view the true American, what makes somebody a true American, in terms of whiteness, nativism, religious nationalism, gender traditionalism, and militarism. So it's about being of European descent, being Christian, born in America. In terms of gender, women are supposed to listen to their fathers and husbands, and men are supposed to be the providers. This ideology also includes ideas about owning and carrying firearms, and that is part of good citizenship, not relying on the police for protection, and serving in the military. So these are constitutive parts of the same ideology. The militarism, the ideas that relate to guns and protection in the form of police or protection in service in the military, and white male supremacy and nativism. When we look at support for white male supremacy, we see that about 14% of those who embrace this ideology are strongly committed to it. And about half, 48%, are somewhat committed to it. They view they support to a great extent these ideas, and about 38% reject this ideology and disagree with it more strongly. When we look at those people who are strong supporters of white male supremacy versus those people who are strong supporters of the inclusive multiculturalist ideology, we see stark differences in terms, first of all, of gun ownership. Firearms ownership correlates with how strongly you're attached to these ideologies. So those who embrace white male supremacy are far more likely to own firearms than are those who are highly supportive of the inclusive ideology, of multicultural ideology. And we see this in the flip here, where among those who are strongly attached to white male supremacy, more than 40% say that they own guns, whereas among the other group, about 30% own guns. We also see these differences when it comes to support for militarized policies. Here I have people who support laws to criminalize protesting in public highways, stand ground laws, and laws that allow people to support to shoot at protesters if they feel threatened. So the basis is what happened in Minnesota, and my idea is that speaking among Americans, for example, I can't think that I think that I would acceptable, but with we see that it's more than that percent of race supremacy are outlawed and more than that the blue bar shows
Dr. Valindra, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's a problem with your audio.
Oh, okay.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. So we see similar events, similar support for anti-democratic practices and norms. I asked people here whether they believe that a majority should always prevail over the rights of a minority, whether we should use all force available to maintain order, and whether the government is so powerful that the people need guns to protect from it. And as we saw in the first panel, there is this ideology, this belief that the reason that people need guns is for political purposes to protect themselves from government. And as my data show, a third of people who embrace white male supremacy have a very antagonistic view of government, and they believe that they need guns to protect themselves from it. And more than 4 in 10 support violent repression in the name of law and order. So they hold very authoritarian views and a very, very competitive and antagonistic view of elected government and of elected institutions. And that is very worrisome. When it comes to protests, we know that guns at protests can be very problematic because that can produce chilling effects. People fear showing up at a protest if they think that there are guns there. And what we see here is that 1 in 5 among those who embrace white male supremacy are very comfortable with guns in protest. They think it is appropriate. And this group is also twice more likely than people in the inclusive category or even in overall white Americans to say that they would attend a protest when guns are present. This suggests that guns in protest not only produce chilling effects, but they produce differential chilling effects based on people's ideology and based on people tolerance to violence and to aggression. So we see that if we allow guns in public protests, and if we allow guns in political spaces, over time, this has the potential to affect who participates in politics, and therefore what our politics looks like in the future. When it comes to violent radicalization, here I use measures from a measure that it was created by social psychologists of terrorism that asked people whether they agree with the idea that to fight with arms to protect one's group's rights is acceptable, and whether they would support a rights organization for their group, even if they used violence. And we see that a small proportion of white Americans are open and vulnerable to violent radicalization. Among those who embrace white male supremacy, again noted here as the high exclusive group, acceptance of violence is far higher. Here we see that 25% among this group says that they're okay if their group fight with arms to protect the group rights, and that 13% say that they would support an organization that uses violence. This is not the case for the highly inclusive ideology, the people who adopt a multicultural view of the world, and also overall in the white American population, these are minority views, but they are held at a much higher rate among people who support white male supremacy. So what we're seeing here is that this is an ideology that has a very long history in American politics and continues to today to draw adherence, especially among white Americans. And as we heard earlier, some younger white American men. There is evidence that the ideology has taken hold within law enforcement, the idea of a warrior cop, and in the armed services. It is a militarized ideology that views gun ownership as an integral component of good citizenship. We have moved past the idea of guns as protection from crime to guns as a symbol of one's good membership in the American in the American polity. Political violence is constitutive of this ideology as well. And it has been for decades, and it has been cultivated within insular communities like that of the gun rights community, like the NRA, and which are socialized to fear and mistrust political institutions and elites and democratic processes. This is not about lone wolves and lone wolf attacks, but rather, and people who have problems with economic insecurity and basically respond to economic insecurity. My data suggests that this ideology is far more widespread within specific sections of the population, and it can be leveraged to generate and fuel group grievances to the point of embracing political violence. Political elites that use militarized metaphors and firearms and the language of violence fuel this fire. Emphasizing common values and peaceful resolution is crucial in damping down this phenomenon. Continued militarization of society, both in terms of gun proliferation and militarized political rhetoric, will continue to accentuate social divisions and incentivize groups and individuals to act out in violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Filindra. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Angela Stroud.
All right. So, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm happy to be a part of this conversation today. Um, my talk follows really nicely on the heels of Alexandra's work, because it asks us to think about what are some potential policy implications we might want to keep in mind, which sometimes those of us who study these issues from a cultural perspective can struggle to do. We can diagnose the roots of these issues, but a cultural diagnosis doesn't always lend itself to clear and specific interventions. How do we eradicate an ideology of white supremacy, for example? This was brought up in an earlier panel. And perhaps we can suggest why it's critical to do a better job of vetting members of the military or the police. But we also know that white supremacy is institutionalized. It's a structuring logic in policing and the military, which is why Tyree Nichols can be beaten to death by Black officers, but the assault can still be explained and should be as being a consequence of white supremacist violence. And though Nichols didn't have a gun on him, the case is still directly linked to gun violence. The over-aggressive tactics that police are trained and encouraged to use, including dehumanizing those they're charged with protecting, exists largely because the police are taught to assume that the people they are policing, particularly young Black men, are armed. This is one of the most unjust dynamics of gun politics, but it's also central to so many of our cultural and structural realities. White males drive gun culture, which leads to the proliferation of firearms, but it's Black men, children, and communities who are the ones most harmed. Yes, the white male suicide rate is higher than other groups, except Native Americans, a statistic that's almost always ignored when we cite that information. But if we add up the total impact of gun violence, so injury, death, the devastating consequences of living in an area plagued by high crime, which includes under and over policing and social abandonment, there's no doubt that Black Americans experience the brunt of our gun violence problem. But everyone is affected to some degree. Pervasive gun violence is a cultural reality that is now increasingly normalized. And my interest is in finding ways to resist this normalization at the cultural level. For reasons I'll explain, this is the premise under which I think the open carry of firearms should be banned, which some jurisdictions and states are actually working toward. I'll acknowledge up front that my argument might not seem to go far enough for some. As I wrote about in my 2016 book on concealed carry, I accept allowing well-trained private citizens the right to carry concealed firearms. Not only is that cat already out of the bag, especially after the Bruin decision, but I understand that some people have compelling reasons to be armed. Training, actual training, not 1 day, 4-hour certificate sessions should be required and stand your ground laws revoked to ensure that only those who are prepared for the risk and responsibility elect to do so. But I want to suggest that we need to make a clear distinction between concealed carry and open carry. Open carry is an entirely different story. And it's brand new, really. We think of it as like this historical thing, but it's not. If we think about how gun culture has changed in recent years, this is a brand new phenomenon. As I'll show, open carry in public, including at political protests, has cultural consequences that we're not sufficiently accounting for as we try to understand what drives the proliferation of firearms. And as was mentioned in the intro, I'm working on a current project interviewing political progressives and liberals who are now taking up guns in self-defense, many of whom were previously anti-gun. I'm not going to focus on that today, though. As I was trying to untangle some of the issues I'm seeing in those interviews, this led me to want to focus today on explaining what I see as the cultural link between white supremacist patriarchal authority and the cultural consequences of open carry. And I'm going to focus on what open carry means in terms of its symbolic power. To do so, I'm going to situate my remarks in the context of this idea of legitimate violence. So, according to sociologist Max Weber, the state is a relation of men dominating men, a relation supported by the means of considered to be legitimate violence. If the state is to exist, the dominated must obey the authority claimed by the powers that be. The state can compel us, in other words, to obey laws because it maintains on what Weber calls a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. This means that, with the exception of self-defense, only the state can legally enact violence against us. The line about legitimate violence is key. We know, of course, that the state has a long history of perpetrating violence against citizens that those of us committed to justice know to be illegitimate, a fact that hangs over these issues of whose rights to self-defense are protected. The state can permit individuals, though, to have access to the means of legitimate violence. But critically, it still controls this process. Much to the chagrin of Second Amendment zealots, God does not grant us the right to own guns. Laws do, the state does. But it's really important to really unpack what that means, given this idea of legitimate violence. Robert Spitzer explains that maintaining a monopoly on legitimate violence is crucial for state order. Otherwise, quote, politics quickly devolves into violence, precisely what occurs when regimes in the modern world are shaken or toppled by violence without stable regime replacement or succession, and when weak regimes lack the ability to quell violence and mayhem within their countries, end quote. That sounds familiar to us, perhaps. Maybe some of the participants on January 6th were hoping for that. But in our nation's capital, the state effectively controls a monopoly on legitimate violence. Imagine if DC did not have among the strictest gun laws in the nation. Not only are concealed carry licenses really difficult to get in the district, but it doesn't honor any licenses from any other jurisdictions. Open carry is banned. And penalties for violating gun carry laws in the district are harsh, up to a 5-year sentence if one is found carrying an unregistered firearm or carrying one in a prohibited place. And there are many prohibited places in Washington, D.C., including the Capitol and at public demonstrations. This example matters not because the insurrectionists on January 6th might otherwise have had enough capacity to overthrow the US government. Instead, laxer gun laws would have allowed the insurrectionists a much larger armed show of force. They would have gotten farther in their efforts. There would have been even more violence and deaths, and there would be fewer legal means to prosecute those who carried guns that day. And if the hammer of the justice system did not descend on them in the aftermath in the way that it is now doing, including in the many felony convictions that will now bar those convicted from ever being legal gun owners again, the lesson of January 6th would be very different. These lessons matter not only for political extremists, but for anyone wondering whether we have a functional state. The cultural legacy of January 6th, how we remember what happened, is critically important. And you might ask, well, remembered by whom? And that's part of what I'm getting at. Culture is a site of struggle where we battle over which kind of world we're creating, what version of truth will prevail, which version of history will be taught or remembered, what lessons will we learn, and how then will these lessons show up in the future? One of the key stories that those opposed to the proliferation of firearms should amplify is that DC's strict gun laws worked. There need not be fatalism, I think, even given the Heller and Bruin decisions. Concealed carry is still legal in the district. It's just heavily regulated and open carry is banned. When we examine the legacy of January 6th, we should recognize the importance of DC's restrictive gun laws. A cultural analysis helps us to understand that open carry is consequential because of what it symbolizes and signifies, particularly in terms of dominance and authority in the hands of white men. When this is done at public protests, conveying that they are an extension of the state, that's what the whole deal with legitimate violence is about, not submissive to it. Political demonstrations are public arguments, important components of the democratic process. When private citizens attend visibly armed, they're embodying the terms of legitimate violence, the capacity for domination over others. They're stating that violence can be used if they don't approve of what elected officials are doing, enforcing grazing laws on federal land, issuing mask mandates during a pandemic, marching to agitate for the removal of Confederate statues, or debating gun violence prevention laws. To use guns or to show that one is ready and willing to use guns, which is what carrying one in public, especially at protests, is intended to do, is not protected free speech. It is an anti-democratic threat, part of what Joshua Horowitz and Casey Anderson refer to as insurrectionism. Quote, in this view, might, whether political or physical, makes right, and government can never make legitimate claims against individuals on behalf of the community, even when decisions are made by democratic means with strong guarantees for individual rights, end quote. The First Amendment grants us the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances, not the right to threaten violence if we don't like what our elected officials are doing. And one aside about insurrectionism and cultural memory, though I need to read Alexandra's book to flesh this out more, as it occurs to me how often pro-gun organizations invoke the American Revolution and the founding fathers as their models when they argue against any and all gun laws. But in their rhetoric, their disregard for democracy and the centrality of white supremacist patriarchal symbolism, they really seem to be evoking the Civil War and specifically the Confederacy as their model, much more so in the American Revolution. Open carry is particularly significant because of how race and gender are implicated in these representations. Perhaps in part because they can feel confident that they're likely to have the support of the police and the courts, white men represent an overwhelming majority of those who are emboldened by carrying an object that grants them the capacity to enact legitimate violence. I've written elsewhere about why guns are so appealing to white men who see their identities as good guys expressed in their ability to fight back against a culture that they imagine is being degraded by this fusion of a racialized, poor criminal class. And this is part of why Rittenhouse became a darling of the right. His acquittal meant his actions were legitimized by the state, and so he could become a hero to Tucker Carlson and Trump and Lauren Boebert and others. And we should recognize what was being done in his 15 minutes of fame after his case. This is discursive work to justify the violence he unleashed. Cultural work was required because of the absurdity of the events and the outcome of the trial. There are laws on the books in the state of Wisconsin, where I live, that permitted a 17-year-old to carry a semi-automatic rifle on public streets during a protest. He wasn't protecting his own private property. He was wandering around looking for action. This is, on its face, unreasonable. 2 people were killed and a third seriously wounded, but the right rallied to embrace Rittenhouse because of what his case symbolized. To them, he was a good guy standing up to Black Lives Matter protesters. A third reason to resist open carry is that white men are not only disproportionately likely to take up firearms in public, they're also more protected in those rights than racial ethnic minorities. Remember that after shooting 3 people, killing 2 of them, Rittenhouse, still strapped with a rifle on his body, walked past the police and left the scene, even as protesters yelled that he had just shot people. Earlier in the night, a video captured police offering Rittenhouse bottles of water and thanking him for being there to help them. Jennifer Carlson has written about how licensing boards disproportionately deny Black people access to concealed carry licenses, and chiefs of police often speak of Black men with guns as though they are inherently criminal. The consequence of these associations is clear. Amir Locke, Philando Castile, E.J. Bradford, all Black men who had a legal right to possess a firearm, people who were not committing any crime, but were killed by the police when they thought they were facing a bad guy with a gun. They were not actually granted the ability to engage in the capacity for legitimate violence. Their gun was deemed illegitimate by the police, and they were killed. So when considered in the specific and racialized context of the US, it's clear that the state has historically used and continues to use what they call legitimate violence against communities of color to reinforce race and class hierarchies and to deny them access to democratic processes and institutions. Now, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, part of my current research interests, there's been a growing number of leftists and Black gun owners obtaining firearms and carrying them in public, and organized groups coordinating public carry demonstrations. Critically, these organizations explain their motivations in ways that are very different from the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers. They're invested in community self-defense in a context in which the state is enacting violence against them. And this distinction really matters. But we have plenty of historical precedent to question whether these tactics will ultimately be successful in any systemic way, or whether they will provide cover for even further cracking down on racial justice protesters. So just one example, John Johnson, Grandmaster Jay, he was the leader of the Not Effing Around Coalition. He was recently sentenced to 7 years and 2 months in federal prison, and then 3 years of supervised parole after his release. He was found guilty of 2 counts of assaulting a federal task force officer and brandishing a firearm. According to police, Johnson pointed his rifle, mounted with a flashlight, at a rooftop in Louisville during protests related to Breonna Taylor's murder. Johnson argued that he had no way of knowing who was on the roof, and he did not intentionally point his gun at police officers who he had coordinated with in advance of the demonstration. But he was sentenced to over 7 years in federal custody. In striking contrast, it took actually attacking cops for some of the January 6th insurrectionists to get a sentence of that length. White supremacy has the force of the state behind it. So it is unclear how open carry among the racially marginalized will be a solution to state violence. So where do we go from here? Well, I think there are clear and compelling reasons that we should develop a strong coherent case against open carry and be very specific about open carry as a target. According to researchers here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, a majority of Americans, it's a slight majority, but it is a majority of Americans, support this view. And there are nationwide, that's nationwide data. If we think about state level, community-based, local organizing efforts on this topic, I think there's a lot more possibility to shift the discourse. We could talk about it as a way to promote public safety, protect our First Amendment rights, and tie it to the larger project of the need to defend democracy. I think we also, as a part of this, have to resist and question all forms of legitimate violence that undermine democracy. And here I include advocating for police reform in our local communities around the issues of police presence at public demonstrations. Evidence shows that aggressively armed police inhibit peaceful protests, especially when the protesters are Black or are supporting progressive causes. They catalyze violence, they don't prevent violence. And finally, and this gets to something that was talked about in a earlier presentation, I think we need to aggressively offer counter-insurrectionist discourses rooted in a positive view of the collective that emphasizes the power and the possibility of community, democracy, justice. Fear is powerful, but it is also deflating and isolating, and I think a lot of people are sick of it. People are longing for something better, and we need to be able to articulate through art, organizing, civic engagement, robust support of the public sector. We need to define what a justice-minded community looks like. And for those who feel that that's a naive response, some of my respondents in my current project might say that that's naive, that the only answer to white supremacist violence is that we also take up arms. I'll end by turning to Judith Butler's 2019 essay, Protest Violent and Nonviolent. She said, "For those who claim that violence is only a provisional tactic or tool, one challenge from a principled position is this: do we not already know that tools can use their users? The turn to violence further destroys hope and augments the violence of the world, undoing the livable world. The task remains to rally the we with the power and desire to build the just and livable world." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stroud, for that incredibly informative presentation, really contextualizing the consequences, particularly of people who adhere to this ideology of white supremacy having an almost unlimited power to carry deadly weapon in public. Now we'll turn to Dr. Edelyn Verona.
Yes, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. I am very thankful to be here today to talk about this important topic, and I've really learned a lot from the rest of the conversations in the previous symposium and this one. Today, I want to talk about pandemic era gun purchasing. As many of you know, obviously, or experienced, the pandemic was a really stressful time, and it introduced a lot of uncertainty into people's lives around the world. That included disruptions to social and economic life, obviously the risk of health problems and a potentially life-threatening infectious disease. In the US in particular, this first year of the pandemic was also associated with a lot of social and political upheaval that was driven by some heightened divisions amongst Americans that really resonated due to the pandemic. It brought them out more. It's included protests resisting public health guidelines, protests against police brutality after the death of George Floyd, and controversies around the 2020 presidential election results that culminated in the insurrection of January 6, 2021. The pandemic has extended longer than we hoped for, unfortunately, with thousands of people still dying each week. And the number of deaths due to the pandemic is still fairly high, but it really started to decline precipitously around spring of 2022, particularly after the broad access to vaccines. This first period of the pandemic also saw a lot of people buying guns. So this graph shows kind of big gun purchasing periods in our recent history. But during the early part of the pandemic, from March to July 2020, you saw an estimated 7 million federal background checks applications, and these surpassed the rates recorded during other periods. That includes after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the election of Barack Obama in 2008, and the Sandy Hook shooting. National surveys estimated that about 66% of adults bought guns, and 34% were actually new gun owners, which brought in millions of new gun owners to the country. This gun buying frenzy continued across all of 2020 after that first bump in March 2020. And as you can see in this figure from Miller et al. 2021, gun purchasing increases mapped onto certain events that occurred in the early part of the pandemic. You see the increases in the summer months of 2020 corresponding to the many Black Lives Matter protests. And then upon the inauguration of Joe Biden in January 2021. And at the same time, we saw a corresponding rise in gun violence in 2020 with a continued trend into 2021 and even now. Now, we don't know if this increase in gun sales that occurred early in the pandemic contributed to more gun violence. An early analysis of early gun sales during the pandemic didn't seem to correlate with the firearm violence in that same period, but we don't know enough. One way we thought we could examine whether pandemic era gun purchases have the potential to lead to greater gun violence involves an analysis of pandemic era buyers in particular. So we wondered if these pandemic era gun buyers showed a psychological profile that was consistent with potential risk for violence. So in essence, should we be concerned about into whose hands these extra pandemic era guns ended up? So in a paper that's currently under review, we used data from the COVID-19 Adjustment and Behavior Survey, which was an online survey that was recruited by Qualtrics with quotas for age, sex, and race comparable to the US population. In the wave in which we inserted these relevant items around the pandemic, wave 5, there were over 1,000 participants. And we created 3 different groups: non-gun owners, which is the biggest group, pre-pandemic gun owners. So these are folks that didn't buy a gun during the pandemic, but they were owners prior to. And the smallest group, but still about 10% of the sample, purchased firearms between March 2020 and October 2021 when we first did this data collection. And we wanted to compare these groups we compared these groups on a number of factors, but we'll just highlight a few relevant results for this talk. So on political attitudes, the pandemic era gun buyers were distinct from the other 2 groups, particularly on right-wing ideologies, including pro-gun attitudes and support for Trump. And as you can see, the pre-COVID owners are in the middle in most of these and closer to the gun owners in their endorsements. The COVID gun buyers, the effect size, meaning the difference, how big the difference was between them and the pre-COVID gun owners, was quite big, almost 2 standard deviation larger in their endorsement of these things. And one thing that I want to show that exemplifies the extremism of some of these beliefs is how they scored on the QAnon conspiracy items. I think for most of you know what QAnon is, but here are some of the items and the endorsement across the groups. So those who were COVID gun buyers almost 3/4 endorsed the idea that the government, media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. And only a small percentage, still a little higher than you'd like to think, were endorsed by the other two groups. And concerningly, we saw a similar pattern in terms of violence and externalizing variables, with the pandemic era buyers showing higher levels of intimate partner violence, antisocial behavior, meaning criminal or behaviors that are frowned upon by our society, and alcohol problems. And you see here that, again, the effect size is comparing the COVID gun buyers with the pre-COVID gun owners are fairly large. These would be considered fairly large effect sizes, at least in my field in psychology. And as you can see, the pre-COVID gun owners and non-gun owners actually didn't differ as much. So along with the increase in gun purchases, as some of the other panelists have discussed, the pandemic and the concurrent events that happened during that time heightened the profile of political extremism, especially armed political extremism and white supremacist rhetoric. So we wanted to follow up on our previous results to see if pandemic era buyers were characterized by more alt-right and white nationalist beliefs and by higher racial resentment. If so, are these views correlated with risk factors for violence and other harm? If there's this strong congruence here that can create a perfect storm that would fuel hate-related violence in these newer or kind of excess gun owners. So using further waves in this COVID-19 adjustment and behavior survey, we collected more data on this. The N in the larger sample was almost 4,000, but it does differ across analyses, which we'll talk about. Mean age is middle age, around 44, 45, about a little bit more women, but about 50-50, mostly white, but we did have proportional representation of Black and Hispanic participants. And it kind of crossed across political affiliations, although a little bit more Democrat, but you had a quarter Republican and a bit more of that independent or other. And again, we had the three gun groups. Now, because of what we saw as an extension of the pandemic and some of the problems there, we define pandemic era gun buyers as those who purchased firearms between March 2020 and March 2022, so the first 2 years. Our measures that we compared these groups on are right-wing ideology associated with outright identity. So that was one item. We had an item on January 6th insurrection support, and then a 6-item measure of Christian nationalism and identification with that. We had a couple of scales looking at racial resentment, one on anti-Black views that really got into resentment around a sort of equal rights, and then anti-immigration views where people believe that having a lot of newcomers actually threatens traditional values in the US. And then we had a few items on risk factors for violence. One item was just asking them if they had thoughts of shooting someone. And then we had 2 scales on that measured intimate partner violence and antisocial or criminal behavior. So the first question we had: to what extent do pandemic era gun buyers endorse these outright nationalist positions? And as you can see, we find that to a great extent they do relative to the other 2 groups. 60% of COVID gun buyers identify with the goals of the alt-right versus less than 20% in the other two groups. 72% agree with Capitol insurrectionists' attempt to overturn the election. That was less than 30% in the other two groups. And the results are striking in that both white and non-white participants showed similar patterns, although admittedly we had a smaller proportion of non-white participants. Now, what were the views on race and immigration? Here's where we saw more nuance, especially among the non-pandemic or pre-pandemic owners. Anti-Black views seem to characterize both gun groups relative to non-owners. However, this is mostly due to white owners, since non-white pre-COVID owners do not show elevations in any of these race immigration related variables. And we saw anti-immigration views were definitely higher in the COVID era gun buyers, with the pre-COVID gun owners somewhere in between. So these results indicate that gun owners in general, and not just pandemic era buyers, show more racial resentment, mainly if they identify as white. And then the second question was, are these views associated with risk factors for violence or other harms? And partly, first, we found a concerning amount of endorsement of the item about thoughts of shooting someone, with almost half of the pandemic buyers agreeing to it versus 6 to 8% of the other two groups. And second, we looked at the correlations, or these R coefficients, between the right-wing views and risk factors for violence. So how much do these things co-occur? And we saw that in the pandemic buyers in particular, there were fairly strong correlations at medium to large effect sizes in that group between their Christian nationalism, insurrection, and alt-right beliefs, and their antisocial behavior, partner violence, and thoughts of shooting someone. So results suggest we should be concerned that pandemic buyers hold extremist political beliefs sprinkled with these risk factors for violence. However, anti-Black and anti-immigration beliefs were generally not that associated with risk factors for violence, if there's a consolation there, with mean correlations either negative or close to zero for all groups. So in summary, pandemic era gun buyers do show more extremes in right-wing ideology and racial resentment. And this right-wing ideology, but not the racial resentment, was associated with higher risk for violence, including thoughts of shooting someone, and prominently in these gun buyers, mostly accounted for by white pandemic era buyers. One disconcerting was that I thought some views are more normative than we would like across groups. So Christian nationalism and anti-immigration views were not all that unpopular. And both gun owner groups tended to minimize racial inequities and showed anti-Black resentment relative to the non-owners. And that is all.
Thank you so much for that illuminating, if alarming, presentation on pandemic era gun buyers. We'll be turning now to Dr. Garen Wintemute to learn a little bit more about the attitudes of individuals today.
Hi, everybody. Let me get my screen shared. And let me just confirm you all are seeing full screen slides. Great. Okay. Lots of convergence today, as you'll see. And I'm going to move.
Dr. Wintemute, I'm sorry, you're not on full screen share. You go to presentation mode.
Now I am. There we go. Sorry. Appreciate it. I'm going to move quickly and give us some time for Q&A. For reasons that have largely been mentioned already, We undertook a survey looking at the themes that form the title of the slide and quite a bit else, but this is what I'm going to talk about today. We were in the field last year in May and June. We used the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, which is an address-based probability sample designed and weighted to be nationally representative. We had about 8,600 respondents. The exposures we're interested in today, and I'll get into the detail, are racist beliefs, support for extreme right organizations and movements, and support for violence in general as an agent for social change. The outcomes that we're interested in are support for and personal willingness to engage in political violence, and we'll look at the variation in these associations with firearm ownership. So here's our first exposure, and Cronbach's alphas are at the top for those who want those things. We provided these 5 statements. I'll let you read them, with which respondents could disagree or agree in various levels of strength. And the coding here that I'm going to be using is that strong agreement meant agreeing with all 5 or hitting all 5, checking all 5 boxes as described. Some of them require disagreement. Non-agreement is the reverse. You had to check none of the 5 boxes. There are some intermediate groups that I'm not going to talk about today for the sake of time and simplicity. So that's our first exposure, racist beliefs. The second is support for extreme right-wing organizations and movements. You get the model here. Those are the organizations and movements. We named them. We asked about them one at a time, and eventually we have sufficient numbers. We will be reporting on support for each of these organizations and movements individually in association with our outcomes. But for today, we're talking about an aggregate. Because support's relatively uncommon, what I'm going to be showing you as approval meant a statement of strong or very strong approval for at least one of the 7, although most of those who said yes to one said yes to several. But non-approval meant expressing disapproval of all of them. Again, a mixed category that I'm not going to talk about. In the final exposure, support for violence as an agent for social change involves these 3 statements, at least one of which you've seen already. It's fun to see some seminal work done a couple of years ago would suddenly branch into a lot of work that you're seeing today. But people were presented these 3 statements. Strong agreement, as you'll see it in just a moment, required strong or very strong agreement with all 3 of them. Non-agreement required disagreement with all 3 of them, and there's a mixed category that I won't talk about. Let's talk about how firearm ownership is associated with exposure. We asked these people about their ownership at the time of the survey. We also asked if they'd bought guns recently. And thanks for the prior presentation. We had planned on it, but now the fire is really lit to compare people who bought firearms during the pandemic and people who didn't. So what you'll see here is, actually before I get into the table, we had 3 categories of ownership: personal owners, non-owners who live with owners. I'm not presenting that category. It's mostly women. It's small, and I wanted simpler tables, and non-owners with none in the home. What you can see is that for the sample as a whole, about 28% were personal owners, but personal owners are very much overrepresented among those who express strong agreement with racist beliefs, approval of right-wing organizations and movements, and strong agreement with the idea that violence is a legitimate means of social change. Let's look at support for political violence. We asked people, I do need to read something here for you. I want you to understand the measuring tool. Here's what we presented in the survey. People sometimes talk about using force or violence to achieve political objectives. In general, what do you think about using force or violence to advance an important political objective that you support? Force or violence was also defined as physical force sufficient to harm someone. So we asked in general, as you see in the middle column here, we also asked about 17 specific circumstances, and I'm going to give you a couple of those. What you see presented are weighted percentages with their 95% confidence intervals. And what you can see is that by sometimes quite striking margins, our exposures are associated with support for political violence in general. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. What the percentages refer to are the people who said that political violence was usually or always justified for each of these circumstances. We did not include a sometimes justified option that was quite common. Our reasoning being lots of people could think of extraordinary circumstances under which they might support violence. So you're looking here at usually or always justified in general. And then to return Donald Trump to the presidency this year, recall that the survey was in the field last year in 2022. The margins are sometimes quite large, as you can see. The prevalences for those with the exposure as defined are sometimes quite high. Here are two more of those specific circumstances. The one in the middle was, I'm quoting directly from the questionnaire, to preserve an American way of life based on Western European traditions. And the one on the right is to stop people who do not share my beliefs from voting. And here what you can see is, again, quite strong association between our exposures and support for violence as usually or always justified, to preserve a particular form of particular way of life. When it came to stop people I disagree with from voting, we did not see an association between endorsing racist beliefs and endorsing violence under that circumstance, but we certainly did, and again by quite a wide margin, see an association between support for right-wing organizations and support for violence as an instrument of social change in general and stopping people I disagree with from voting. We asked everybody who supported political violence, even at the sometimes level. We did not ask this question of people who over and over again in general and across 17 specifics said, no, it's never justified. But if they ever crossed even a bit over the threshold, we said, okay, then what about you yourself? And again, I will read to you from the questionnaire. In a situation where you think force or violence is justified to advance an important political objective, how willing would you personally be to use force or violence in each of these ways? The percentages are for those who said, I would be very willing or I would be completely willing to use force or violence. We asked about several things. I'm giving you just a couple of them. And what you can see is that endorsement of racist beliefs was not associated with an increase in willingness to threaten or intimidate somebody or kill somebody, but that endorsement of right-wing organizations and of violence as a general means of social change was strongly associated, and the prevalences among those exposed are quite high, given the outcomes that we're looking at. And then we asked everyone, regardless of their position on political violence in all of the items that I've mentioned so far, to think forward. And I'm going to paraphrase to save some time. We asked them to think into the future and asked how likely they thought it would be that they would use a gun in the next few years in any of several ways, specifically in a situation where they thought force or violence was justified to advance an important political objective. And I've shown you some of several outcomes involving firearms. And what you can see is that across the board, there was a strong association between exposures and, I'm sorry, the outcome here is reporting it as very or extremely likely that in the next few years, they will engage in the behavior that heads the column. So a strong association between the exposures and being armed, Absolute magnitude's lower, but still a statistically significant association between endorsing right-wing organizations and violence for social change, and, if you will, a personal commitment to shoot somebody in the future in a situation involving political violence. We looked at firearm ownership status. Obviously, the money question was, is the association between exposure and outcome accentuated by firearm ownership? And we did not find that, and we're still exploring why. What we did find is what's on the slide, that there was an increase in support for violence that was associated with two of the exposures. And for violence in general, and to stop those who disagree with me from voting, was greater among non-owners with no firearms at home than among personal owners. So among non-owners, those exposures are associated with an increased support for violence. And this coming will be my last slide. Here's our summary, that there was very strong support, that very strong support for racist beliefs, extremist organizations, violence to produce social change is not rare. Firearm owners are overrepresented among those showing such support. We have not done adjusted risk differences yet, and I suspect we'll see that difference change some. All of the exposures are associated with support for political violence and to some extent with firearm use, and affiliations with right-wing organizations and for violence as a means of social change are associated with personal willingness to engage in violence. And I will stop there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wintemute, and to all of our panelists. I am more troubled than ever by each of your presentations, but we will move into question and answer, and perhaps be soothed by some options to address this very dangerous intersection, and learn a little bit more about it. I want to first ask Dr. Filindra, of the people that you interviewed, policymakers and their staff, did any of the individuals who reported being threatened or experienced violence, did any of those instances involve guns?
Yes, they did. And we have seen cases of threats and violence involving guns in the news as well, like what happened in New Mexico with elected officials' homes being shot at. We had people who reported threats that were threats of armed violence, things like, if you don't do what I say, there's a bullet coming for you, type of thing. And we've also had cases where one respondent said that somebody showed up at their office and took bullets out of his pocket and threw them like this on the table and said, "This is coming to you." So we've seen references to firearms and to gun violence as a political means to achieve some kind of result.
Thank you for that. Dr. Stroud, you did such an incredible job of laying out the consequences and the culture that's created when we allow ubiquitous open carry. I'm wondering if you could discuss a little bit of the research from your book to expand that discussion to some of the disparities that exist within concealed carry as well.
Yeah, so, the thing about guns is how much has changed in a short amount of time. When I was working on that project, I started that project in 2009. And at the time, people were like, well, concealed carry, what is this? And a lot has changed. The book was going into final print when Texas moved to an open carry state. And from that point to now, 7 years later, we see this just incredible kind of revolution even in who is obtaining licenses and who is purchasing guns, though the information shared today is very important because we actually don't know that much about who's purchasing firearms. But at the time with that project, it was certainly the case that among concealed carry holders in Texas, there was an overwhelming percentage of white men who were the ones driving this process and this sort of practice. And, in a state at the time where white non-Hispanic men represented something around 35% of the population, about 80% were license holders at that time. And so they were also the ones least likely to be victims of violent crime. So another statistic that has changed significantly over time. I mean, they're still the least likely to be victimized. But that's always what's been at the top of mind for me with this sort of topic is that what I said at the beginning of my presentation, white men drive this culture, white men drive the proliferation of firearms, but they are the least likely to live with the consequences of that. So when I think of disparities, I think about that question, like who's driving this problem and who then is living with the consequences. And of course, I note suicides are that one category that we have to keep in mind. But I think there's a case to be made that doesn't really balance out what's happening here when we think about gun proliferation and violence.
Thank you. Dr. Verona, you laid out this incredible data on the different attitudes of non-gun owners, pre-pandemic gun owners, and pandemic-era gun buyers. And I'm wondering if you think that some of these notable differences are unique to the conditions created by the pandemic, or if this is something that you expect will persist even as we, I hope, find a way to manage this health crisis.
Yeah, Kelly, thank you. That's a great question. And I've thought about this a little bit. I do think that the pandemic brought up a unique set of circumstances that may have heightened some of this interest amongst this group, and that maybe was a little bit more dormant around that time. But one thing that we find is that once folks, even if you have a pre-selection towards sort of gun culture, once you have a gun, you get more involved in that culture. And I think that the pandemic and a lot of social media use may have brought a lot of people together with sort of more of these kind of extremist views and more opportunities for them to kind of gather around these these ideas and these resentments and complaints that they had, like the QAnon piece. I had never heard of QAnon, even though it's been around since 2019, but the pandemic really brought those people out, especially around the masks. And I mean, I saw community members that I knew who were professionals come and talk about QAnon and the mask and having their kids wear masks in ways that I never. So I think once they're kind of engaged in that culture, they might stay in there, and it might still perpetuate some of those ideas moving forward, is my thought.
Thank you. Dr. Wintemute, it was extremely alarming to see all of the data that you presented in your presentation. One thing that really came to mind for me as I was looking at some of your questions is that we might have wildly different ideas of what is a danger to American democracy, what is eroding American democracy. And so I'm wondering if you could really tease out if there were any questions that tried to differentiate between these different conceptions of tyranny, what it means for a government to be tyrannical, and whether or not there were differences between people who identified as politically conservative or politically liberal.
To take the second part first, we did capture party affiliation and political ideology, and will be and have already published a preprint on that, and we'll be looking a lot at relationships between those two characteristics and all the outcomes we're talking about. We don't have anywhere in the questionnaire the sort of behind the question questions. What do you mean when you say threat to democracy? But the good news is that we are headed back into the field. We're almost done with designing a follow-up survey of those same respondents that will do a couple of things. We're going to ask those questions in particular to the extent that the questionnaire can do it. Separately, we're planning focus groups. Number two, we're going to present to respondents a whole series of validated scales just to augment the information we have on them already. So scales measuring homophobia and Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, support for domestic violence, trait aggression, quite a number of these, and we'll just add them to the pot. And then the sweet spot is we're going to re-ask the questions about political violence a year later so that we'll be able to compare desisters, if there are any, from those who don't.
Well, that is fascinating, and we'll be waiting at the edge of our seats for that updated information. Dr. Felindra, you described in wonderful detail these competing ideas of what it means to be a true American. And based on my understanding of United States history, this exclusive version of being a true American has persisted in all of the time that this has been a country. I'm wondering a couple things, who is leveraging this ideology today, and what can we do to combat people from either adopting it or to maintain it?
So it is an ideology that has very deep roots, and it is an ideology that we see, research suggests it is very deeply rooted in NRA rhetoric, in certain components of the right media ecosystem. It is also part of white evangelical rhetoric and dogma. These ideas are very deeply rooted, especially since the 1970s. So there are communities that used to be, first of all, distinct through the 1960s, and then they sorted politically and coalesced within the broader right-wing conservative agenda. And these ideas now are cross-fertilizing and influencing more people who were part of distinct underlying groups. And we see leaders in politics who are employing very much militarized rhetoric that is tinted in white supremacy. And we see it also implicitly in gun advertisements, in gun rhetoric. It's strongly there, as one of the panelists in a previous panel was saying, for example, references to the Rhodesian War. That was a war of white supremacy, and supporting the Rhodesian War. For those who are participating in this community, they know what that means. This idea of insurrectionism also has very strong white supremacy connotations. People who participate in this culture understand the symbolism, understand the meanings. So it is cultivated, and it's very powerful. It is connected to very deep emotional responses, fears, anger, resentments, grievances that the white community is being left behind, that there isn't enough political attention to their views and their culture. What is happening in education today in Florida, for example, with what should we be teaching in schools is connected to all of this. And it becomes very much promoted within the media sphere, within social media, and it's sort of it's a reinforcing and it's self-feeding situation.
Thank you. In the few minutes we have left in our panel, I'd like to ask a similar question to each of our other panelists, if very briefly. What other policy recommendations would you make based on your research? And I'll start with Dr. Stroud.
Yeah, I'm really on this open carry question right now. I just think so often when we think about gun violence, we think the danger of a gun is that a gun can go off and someone can get killed. But for me, the cultural consequences of these displays is something we underestimate, and we don't think about how do we strategize around culture. And we think about policy, but it's too often we don't do the background work that would compel people to understand why these policies matter. And I think the right-wing media sphere is just so much more coordinated and sort of effective in leveraging these different places because it is their bottom line. It is how they've constructed their business model. And so on the question of policy, to me, state level, community-based, compelling arguments against open carry are a great place to start. And I think that we would have much more traction than we might realize because we really haven't tried in all states. Some places, Washington State, other places have been doing this. But certainly, in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, in Texas, I don't know that I have seen this sort of organized community-based effort around this theme.
Thank you. And in a last couple lightning round answers, the same question for Garen. What policy recommendations would you make?
Second, the motion on open carry. We've got the RAND report out with a good summary of research evidence showing that such policies are violence promoting. And I'll add extreme risk protection orders in the specific domestic violent extremism context. If you see something, say something. States that don't have these statutes should adopt them. States that have them should implement them.
And to you, Dr. Verona.
Yeah, I agree with what others are saying. At this point, I guess I have a low bar, and I just say, if we could just implement federal level policies that are just basic, comprehensive background checks, and close the boyfriend loophole. Some of these things at the federal level, that's just a basic thing that any civilized society should be doing. I think I also want to piggyback on, I think Angelo's talking about socialization, and if we could change some of the this is a huge ask. So I went from very basic to a huge one, which is changing the socialization around masculinity and how guns are associated with this precarious sense of manhood. If there could be kind of a national campaign around that, it would do a lot of good, I think.
Well, I want to thank all of my panelists for an incredible session here this afternoon. I hope that everyone learned quite a lot. We'll be taking a slightly less than 15-minute break and reconvening for our last panel of the day at 3 o'clock.
I think we all agree that this is incredibly important information, and it's also very heavy, especially so if you're Black or living with another minoritized identity. As I'm sitting here, I'm noticing a pain in my head. I'm noticing how tight my shoulders are. So as we prepare to take a break, I invite you to check in and see what you notice in your body. Do something for yourself as we break. Get up, take a walk, stretch, get a snack, take some deep breaths, get some water, take care of yourself, and we will see you back here at 3.